Hello everyone, this is Nero from the channel L'Islam Spiegato da un Cane, and today we have with us one of the most important figures in the ex-Muslim scene, and no, I'm not exaggerating. A warm welcome to Maryam Namazie, who
Thank you
I'm
very
busy.
much. Sorry, great to be here.
I deeply thank you for finding the time to be with us today. And let me quickly introduce you, Mariam. Mariam is an ex Muslim of Iranian origin who started speaking openly about the consequences of leaving the faith and the condition of women within Islam long before anyone else. Anyone who is fighting today to promote universal secular values owes her a great deal. It's impossible to summarize in just a few lines the impressive career of activism to which this woman has dedicated herself with courage and generosity. But I can certainly say that she has tenaciously fought against every form of subjugation. Alongside her commitment to defending the rights of refugees in some of the most unstable and dangerous regions of the world, Mariam has been campaigning for several years against practices such as stoning, mandatory veiling for underage girls, and any attempts by Islamic regimes to marginalize women. Her commitment has been recognized with various awards, and she has received acknowledgement for her work. But, and we should not be surprised about that, she is at the very least considered controversial. So, Mariam, I'd suggest we dive right into the questions if you're ready.
Great, thank you. Yes. And thanks for that great introduction.
Yes, yes, is absolutely due, Mariam, absolutely due. You have all my admiration, and I think very soon you'll have the admiration of my community too. So
Oh, thank
let's
you.
start. So, living Islam is an intensely personal decision that can come with profound emotional and social repercussions. Could you share what this journey was like for you or for other people you know?
I think really it is a very emotional and quite difficult journey to make. And I think there are as many journeys and difficulties as there are people, because it all really depends so much on our own personal circumstances, the sort of societies we live in, the families we live in. So you
Mhm.
have people who find it very easy to leave Islam, and those who find it to be a matter of life and death. And I think, again, there's no right way of doing it. There's no wrong way of doing it. As I said, it's very personal. And for me, it wasn't really religion wasn't really something that occupied a lot of my time or
Mhm.
thoughts. It was something that, I was a Muslim because I was born in a Muslim family and I lived in Iran. I was born and raised there. And it only really became something that I began to grapple with when Islamist forces really took control of a people's revolution that took place in Iran in 1979, 78, 79, and then the establishment of an Islamic state there. And, this sort of immediate targeting of women
Mhm.
and women's bodies as a way of sort of beginning to target all of society. So it was a very quick eye opener on what religion really means for people in general, but women and girls in particular. And so I think for me, that's when I started grappling with it. And of course, then having to leave Iran, becoming refugees, and going to various countries and not being given status, like going to
Mhm.
India for 2 years, then to England for a year, and again we weren't allowed to stay, and then we went to the US, to Yonkers, New York, and that's where I was 17 when we got there, and I started university just 2 months after we arrived. And so it was all of that the sort of repercussions and consequences of an Islamic state and what it means,
Mhm.
pressures that you feel immediately when they come to power, um, not just on women but girls from a very young age. And so I think for me it was that was the eye opener, and that's when I started
Mhm.
really questioning it and thinking about it, and challenging it, and not wanting to be have any part have anything to do with it, basically.
Of course, when you experience the full development of what an Islamic State is, you really have maybe, I guess, a grasp of what the fulfillment of Islam is. I don't know if you agree with this, but I think that what you said sums this.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, you're right. I think it's really the actual personification of all the texts and the hadith and all of that sort of hatred of women in practice
Mhm.
via an Islamic state, Islamic laws, the Sharia. So it has, I think it's very eye opening. And it's interesting, for example, in Iran, why there's such a huge anti Islamic backlash. I
Mm.
think partly because that revolution that was not an Islamic revolution was expropriated, and it has continued in various ways. But also because, that sort of very brutal, sort of naked um, Islamic rule does make people sit up and think about their beliefs and how, inhuman and anti-woman it
Mm.
is.
Mhm. How is the situation of believers in Iran? How's the percentage of people in the closet, of course, living Islam? If you have an idea about this, because I heard about so many Iranian people leaving Islam lately in the last years.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, well, because when you're living in a theocracy, which is a totalitarian state, it's very difficult to actually poll people to know percentages in the way you would maybe in more democratic societies. But I think there are many indications to show that it is very widespread. For
Mm.
example, if you look at comments that have been made by government officials, the Iranian government itself talks about a tsunami of young people going towards atheism and secularism. And you also have the fact that atheism and apostasy and blasphemy are punishable by death. That's another indicator that it is seen to be very threatening to society,
Mhm.
given the fact that it is punished by death legally under the law. And you have a lot of examples, even eh, since the inception of the regime. For example, during the 80s, when there were mass executions in Iran, in one summer in 1988, the Iranian regime executed 5,000 people. And they did,
Apostates? You mean? Do you mean
well,
apostates?
5,000 people, but I want to just tell you the questions they asked. The first question they asked was, do you pray? If the person said no, they were sent off and executed. Do you believe in God? If they said no, they were immediately sent out to execution. So a
Wow.
large number of people were executed in this way, who were atheists, who were apostates. They weren't necessarily executed under apostasy laws in the sense of saying we have this many cases who were executed under apostasy laws, but they were executed based on these questions, which are, signifiers of apostasy or blasphemy and irreligiosity. So that's a more historical example, where recent history, since the inception of the Islamic regime from the 80s, which was called the Bloody Decade. But even if you look, and of course, there's been many other examples, but if you look at the Woman Life Freedom Revolution in Iran,
Yes, of course.
you know, I think there's so many examples to show this sort of irreligiosity and this backlash against Islamic rules. One is, of course, the very slogan "Woman, Life, Freedom," because
Mhm.
Islam is, uh, a religion, like all religions, that sort of erases women, that makes them invisible, that silences them. So to have a revolution based on a slogan, well, women is at its center, shows this sort of backlash in a very practical way. But there are also other examples. For example, one of the first men executed for his participation in the Women Life Freedom Revolution. Majid Reza Rahnavard, on his way to execution. I mean, they're filming him, he's blindfolded, and he's being taken to execution. And they ask him what's his last will and testament. And he says, I don't want them to read the Quran at my funeral. I don't want them to cry or mourn. I want them to celebrate. You have the mother of Kian Pirfalak. He's a 9-year-old who was killed by the regime's security forces during the uprising. And she says at his funeral, loud cheers from people attending, don't read the Quran for my son. My son hated the Quran. And there's so many examples of people at funerals, for example, dancing, removing their hijabs, singing, very different from what is considered, Shia forms of mourning and paying tribute to the dead. It's very, very different. It's a celebration of life. It's pro-life versus pro-death, which is very much the
Of
sort of
course.
Islamic tradition. So there are examples like this. And of course, on social media, I mean, I think social media has really brought to the fore this sort of hatred and backlash of religious rules and religion in a way that we might not have seen. And given the fact that the Women Life Freedom Revolution has happened, it has been led by a Generation Z, that is so social media savvy, you get to see this sort of dislike in a way that you wouldn't before. I mean, of course, the burning of the hijab itself is a huge testament to this anti-Islamic movement and backlash. And also there's another phenomenon that is really something that started only in Iran, which is the the turban flying phenomenon,
Oh,
where young
yes.
people run up behind a mullah and throw off his turban. So this anti-clericalism, this anti-Islamic sentiment is very widespread. And you also see it in the slogans, I mean, and songs, revolutionary songs. There's so many examples I can give you, but there's one song which says, the Quran should stay on the shelf, not in our lives, as a book that's on the shelf, not in our lives. And of course, the slogan saying we don't want an Islamic state. We want a very, very secular, very modern, very sort of progressive demands of this Women Life Freedom Revolution.
So this question comes just straightforward. There's this claim, which drives me actually crazy, that often surface when issues of women's autonomy, bodily control, and unequal rights arise, especially stories of coercion, force, of subjugation. That is not about religion, it's about culture. This narrative seems to deflect responsibilities away from religious institutions and beliefs, avoiding a necessary confrontation with the systemic control a religion can have over women's lives. How do you view this claim? What are the dangers of attributing these issues to culture rather than acknowledging the role of religion in these matters?
Well, I mean, I think there's several points to this question. One is on the issue of culture itself. Culture is not a monolith. It's constantly changing. It's being revised. And the question that always comes to mind is whose culture are you talking about? Because you have the culture of the Islamists that stone women to death, or are you talking about the culture of the woman who doesn't want to be stoned, and the culture of those who try to save the woman from a stoning, or who are against Islamic practices? Are you talking about the culture of those who fast during Ramadan, or those who defy fasting rules at risk of persecution and imprisonment? So again, it's not a monolith. And saying that it's a cultural issue is kind of, I think, one of the ways in which there's an attempt to safeguard religion from criticism. Because if we look at culture, let's say, as a monolith for ease of an argument, well, these sort of practices, whether it be the execution, for example, of apostates and of atheists and of blasphemers. There's over a dozen countries that does that with very different cultures. If you look at it, socially speaking, on a societal level, and so it's not just about one culture. It's not just about a cultural practice. And I think, in a sense, if you look at religion, if you look at the text, if you look at the Sunnah or the Hadith or the sayings and actions of Muhammad, Islam's prophet, if you look at Islamic jurisprudence,
Mm-hmm.
if you look at Sharia laws in countries where it is being implemented, if you look at the actions and statements of Islamic movements and states, and Hezbollah to, I don't know, Daesh to Boko Haram to, the Saudi regime to whichever one you take, fundamentally they all have the same
The
view
same.
um, about women, about apostates, about atheists, about religious minorities, about LGBT, you name it, about freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, everything. Uh, they have very, very similar views. And not just them, even people who run Sharia courts in Britain, for example, are
Oh,
implementing the same point of view as the Iranian state or the Taliban, for example, to the extent that they're able to, of course, within a society where Islam is not the law of the land. So I think, in a sense, you have to it's a simple looking at the texts and the practices and the tenets of religion to see how very much the status of women, the status of free thinkers and minorities, religious or sexual minorities, are very much a result of religion and its tenets and dogma.
of course, of course. Even because those matters you just mentioned are the common denominator. And what is the common denominator of this all this matter? It's actually Islam. We have to face it. This reply sometimes, I think, it's just an attempt to silence whomever wants to talk about those matters.
Well, I mean, definitely it's an attempt to silence, but it's also an attempt to protect. I think there are a lot of ways in which the religious right, the fundamentalists, and not just the Islamists, but the Christian right or the Hindu right, the Buddhist right, the Jewish right,
Mhm.
that they use in order to protect religion. And I
Mhm.
think, for example, one is this idea that it's culture, not religion. The other is, for example, the accusation of Islamophobia. You have it
Mhm.
also now, we see it in the Palestinian Israeli
Yeah.
conflict, what I think is a genocide that has been taking place. Criticism of the state of Israel is immediately labeled as anti Semitism. And of course, anti Semitism exists in the same way that anti Muslim bigotry and xenophobia exists. But criticizing a state or a religious right movement or a religion, which is an idea really and a belief that should be open to criticism, they're very different from hatred or bigotry against people. So I think that's one important point. The other is that, look, a lot of people who are consider themselves progressive, they are critical of, for example, Catholicism or Christianity, or, for
Mhm.
example, in Britain, Church of England's role, and historically as well, very much so in opposing the church's role in violating women's rights or children's rights and so on and so forth. So, for example, a lot of the movements for rights, if you look at the suffragette movement, if you look at the women's liberation movement, if you look at the gay rights movement, a lot of these movements uh, were put forth also and particularly as a challenge to Christianity, for example,
Mhm.
because of Christianity's role in perpetrating and even sort of justifying violations against gay people or women and so on and so forth. So, for example, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's a well-known U.S. suffragette, she, for
Mhm.
example, said there's no greater obstacle to women's emancipation, I think, or liberation she used, I'm not, it's not an exact quote, but is the Bible and the church, So uh, the reality is that a lot of human rights, civil rights movements have been in challenge to religion. And so why would Islam be any different? Our demand for rights for apostates and for women and for LGBT or whatever is obviously going to be in challenge to religious rules and Islamic rules and its tenets. And so
Mm,
obviously, criticizing an idea is part and parcel of bringing about change for the better. And again, there are lots of Muslims. I mean, I want to add this here too, because there is this reality, of course, that those who are racist, those who are fascist, those who are bigoted, and you have quite a few of them in the Italian government right now.
of
Uh,
course, yes, we
well,
do.
they cannot between criticizing an idea and criticizing a religious right movement and attacking people. And so when they criticize Islam, they mean Muslims. When they criticize an Islamic practice, they mean Muslims, they mean
Mhm,
refugees, they mean migrants. And I think it's important to remember that people are individuals and they have to be held accountable for their own actions. But there
exactly.
are lots and lots of Muslims who have stood up against uh, the religious right, against Islamism, that have been critical of Islamic practices. And a lot of reason why people flee theocratic states or Islamic states is because they're not in agreement with a lot of the practices. And so you can't generalize about people because they, in a sense, when you think about religion, it's an idea, and so it's very much the lived experience. So I grew up in a Muslim family. I didn't have to wear the veil. My mother converted to Islam. She was Christian to marry my father, but she could still eat pork. She didn't have to wear the veil either. I was never prevented from mixing with boys. I never had to fast during Ramadan, for example. These were not compulsions on me. And there are lots of families. I mean, things have changed, of course, because of the rise of the religious right. You do see the impact on families that were
Mm,
initially very secular, but there isn't, no family, no community, no society is a monolith. And I think we have
mm.
to remember that when we criticize Islam or Islamism, very much so, we're doing it out of a defense of people's rights. And that includes people who consider themselves Muslims.
Exactly. And this is the main error that is done, completely identifying people with their religion. Absolutely. I totally agree. So, coming back to woman, you published a book named The Woman's Quran, where only one sentence is printed. The Quran, Islam, and Islamism are the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation. The rest of the book consists of blank pages. This minimalist and powerful approach feels like a piece of contemporary art to me, actually. Could you share with us what led you to conceive this idea in this unique format? How did it came to life?
But a lot of the work we do as activists is also learning from the actions of previous activists who made lasting change. For example, now when we are trying to address the issue of sex apartheid in Afghanistan and Iran, a lot of our arguments are based on those which were made against race apartheid in apartheid South Africa at the time, for example. And right now, we're calling for sex apartheid, or what's also known as gender apartheid, to be seen as a crime against humanity. It's based on the fact that activists against racial apartheid were able to uh, ensure that racial apartheid was seen as a crime against humanity in international law. And so the idea of the Women's Quran came from, again, the suffragette, the US suffragette I mentioned, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who herself put together a woman's Bible. And her woman's Bible was, in a sense, work that is done by those who are called Islamic feminists, really, people who want to, from within, try to challenge interpretations of the Quran or the Bible or whatever, in order to show that it's not as bad as it seems for women. It's the problem is that men who are misogynists have interpreted. If women interpreted, then it'll be wonderful, or at least better. And I kind of felt like, no, that's definitely not the angle that I would take. I don't believe in liberation theology. I think theology cannot be liberating. I think you cannot interpret something that's so deeply and fundamentally misogynist to be more woman friendly. And I think the proof is in the reinterpretations that we've seen. A lot of Islamic feminists, their reinterpretations really isn't good enough. This idea that the surah in the Quran, which says that women should be, in a final analysis, beaten for being disobedient, they really don't mean beaten with like a stick or something, but beaten with a miswak or a toothbrush,
Yeah.
or a feather. It's symbolic, or that sort of interpretation to me just seems more misogyny, really. Why should a woman be beaten in any case, in any way, or any shape or form? And so I think for me, I felt like, I want to learn from that experience, but I come from a anti-religious perspective, really, one that doesn't see the positives of religion. I mean, I understand that religion can be positive for personally for some people, because it gives them comfort and makes them feel better about what's going to happen after they die. But for me, I think religion is such a negative force in the world. And so I felt like I have to make this Quran completely blank,
Ah,
because I don't see anything good in the Quran for women. And that was the point of it. Of course, I've been doing my own fatwas now to put in the
wow.
new women's Quran. So because I do think humor is a very good way of challenging things that are very frightening and seem to, be that you're not allowed to question it, you're not allowed to challenge it, you're not allowed to poke fun at it. You will die if you do. I think
Mm.
poking fun at things just makes it much easier for others to challenge it as well, and takes away some of that power that religion has, or the religious right have.
And I think that humor is the smartest way to verify if a regime or a school of thought, whatever, can bear, a laugh. If you can measure how healthy it is. So perhaps not everyone here in Italy at least knows that for several years now, Sharia courts have been operating in the United Kingdom as religious tribunals. While they are not officially part of the British legal system, correct me here if I'm wrong, they are authorized to resolve family, marital, and civil disputes for those who choose to turn to them. However, those courts have raised serious concerns regarding human rights, particularly for women, as always, who often face the systemic discrimination under such religious laws. You initiated the One Law for All campaign in Great Britain to oppose Sharia courts in the UK. Could you share with us the current state of the situation?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think also, just to let everyone know, is that there's also a Jewish court, which is called the Beth Din,
Ah,
and they're a much older court, and they also are discriminatory against women. It's only very Orthodox women who do go to them, but there are many cases, for example, of women being denied divorces, and being kept locked into marriages that they don't want to be, because the Beth Din won't give them a divorce. And the Sharia courts is really a much newer phenomenon. It came into being in the 1980s, and it's right after an Islamic State was established in Iran, And we've been seeing the rise since then of the Islamic movement, Islamic states, Islamic laws. So it's very much the argument we make about Sharia courts is it's very much linked with the Islamic movement, and it's part of the Islamist project to
Mm,
control women. And of course, they don't have the hudud laws here based on the criminal laws of amputations or stonings and so on, but they are implementing family code. And
mm,
as we all know, in countries under Sharia, the family code is highly discriminatory against women and girls, and it's very much a legal sort of form of violence against women, discrimination against women, systematic discrimination and violence against women. And so, as you said, it's not, in a sense, it's not part of the legal system, but in a way it is, because in Britain, as I think in other countries, you can use arbitration courts that are specialized if you want to go to a judge that is well versed in the area that you are having an issue on, a dispute on. So for example, there are over 300 arbitration courts here in the UK. For example, if you have a question of employment or a business question, you want to go to a judge who understands the employment issue details. You wouldn't necessarily go to civil court for that.
mhm.
And when you go to an arbitration court, you agree that you will abide by the decision that that judge makes. And so Sharia courts and councils are using, or the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal, they're using the Arbitration Act in order to decide on cases. But what's interesting about this is that while it's not illegal,
Mm,
it should be illegal, because family matters, again, is not an area that arbitration courts should be dealing with, because it has to do with domestic violence, child
mhm.
custody, divorce, things that make women very vulnerable in relationships, particularly when violence is involved. So one of the things we're campaigning for is that it should actually be illegal, because also when you look at the arbitration courts, the two parties have to be on equal footing. But we know under
Mm, of
Islamic
course.
law, a woman's testimony is worth half of the man's. And also, the people going before an arbitration court need to have gone completely voluntarily. And our argument is that there's a lot of coercion in forcing women to go to courts where their rights are going to be violated. Because, for example, the woman wants a divorce, the Sharia court might not give it to her. So she would be better off in a civil court. Why would she go somewhere where her rights would be violated? In the question of child custody, in
Of
a
course.
in
I
a
was about
civil
to ask you about that actually.
yeah, I mean, in a civil court, for example, the child welfare will be paramount. So the court will decide maybe the father can't even have any contact with the child because of his violence and abuse. Whereas in a Sharia court, you find that a man gets the child at a preset age, irrespective of child welfare. So there's all these issues that make it really detrimental to women's rights. The problem in the UK is that because Britain is not really a secular state. It's got the Church of England as an established church. You've got bishops in the House of Lords. You've got prayers in Parliament. I mean, it's pretty absurd and ridiculous when you see the level of influence that the church continues to have in Britain. Whilst, of course, it's a very secularized society and very few people go to the church anymore. So it's quite
Mm,
a contradiction. But I think for the ruling church, having, because you do see, for example, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time saying that there's nothing wrong with Sharia courts, because I think it helps to continue to maintain religion's role in various ways. And that's why you see the rise of Islamic schools and Jewish schools to be on par with Christian schools, Catholic schools, or Church of England schools as a way of maintaining religion's role. So I think Sharia courts have continued, despite a very strong campaign that we've led with wonderful women's rights organizations and veteran women's rights organizations like Southall Black Sisters, for example, it continues to stay because really religion is quite untouchable in Britain, given its history and also the power it has today.
Yes, of course. And religions parting together, they stay together to keep the status quo going on in some way. So they protect each other. And maybe 2 days before they were fighting against each other, but when it's convenient, they they get together. Wow.
Yeah,
And
it's true.
I wanted to add another question about the UK situation, since it's very, worrying watching everything from here. What are your thoughts on the government and local authorities' response to the issues of grooming gangs in the UK? It came up lately again.
Mm. Well, I mean, I think with the grooming gangs, the reality is that there is, of course, the sort of misogyny in sections of, let's say, the Pakistani community, for example, or
Mm,
uh, I don't know, various communities where there's this very misogynist view of women and their bodies. And
mm,
of course, what I wanted to say though is that I think the grooming gangs have been taken seriously to the extent that it's it's something that has been challenged, including by members of parliament in court. And you have this argument that um, far right groups like Tommy Robinson, for example,
of
they
course.
make it seem as if they're the ones who brought grooming gangs to the fore, whereas in fact,
Yes.
it is something that feminists have been doing for many decades, bringing this to light. And I think it's sort of, in a sense, there's so much happening against women and girls because of this sort of overarching misogyny that's part and parcel of every society. What we saw in
Mhm.
France, for example, against Giselle Pellicot, and all those men who
Mhm.
came and raped her while she was drugged. No one talks about that as a grooming gang, or um, the need to deport all those men, or to stop white men from entering villages from now on because of what's happened. Or you've got all the sort of rape and pedophilia that takes place in the church, for example. What I want to say is that misogyny and violence against women is something that is pervasive, all pervasive. And while the grooming gangs need this attention, the sort of blaming all immigrants and Muslims, or all Pakistanis, for example, is quite problematic. It sort of uses, because the reality, what I feel when I read about these things is that it's not out of a concern for women's rights that
Mhm.
these arguments are made. It's the same with the three girls, for example, who were killed in Southport um, by
Mhm.
um, by a young man who was actually born in Britain. The sort of the far right riots that happened afterwards wasn't because they really cared about violence against women. It's
Of course.
because they wanted to use it as a way of targeting migrants and Muslims. So I think, wait, he wasn't even a Muslim, but that's how it works. And so
At
the
first,
whole
they said
grooming,
he was, but then they say that the police didn't want to share the nationality or the religion of the guy, but he was a Christian, I think.
they
Or
didn't share it because of his age. He was
Mhm.
underage, and that's why I think it was an age-related thing. But anyway, what I want to say is that the focus on grooming gangs, when there's so much violence against women, also, for example, what the Taliban is doing in Iran, in Afghanistan, what the Iranian regime is doing, all the women who are fleeing and coming here, there's no demand by these groups that are so against grooming gangs, for example, to defend women's rights, give them asylum or refugee status. So I think there's a way in which violence against women is used to promote sort of right-wing, far-right politics without any real solution for an end to violence against women, whether it be so-called honor crimes, whether it be grooming gangs, whether
Mm.
it be violence against girls in Islamic schools and madrasas. It's all linked also with other types of violence that is prevalent in much of in all of the world, really. Violence against women, it hasn't ended anywhere, even in countries which are considered so progressive and so pro women's rights, like Scandinavian countries. There is large amounts of domestic violence, for example.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so again, this is not an issue that has an easy response, but I think what the far right also has done is to take credit for highlighting the grooming gangs when actually Tommy
Yes.
Robinson endangered the court case by highlighting things that were not meant to be highlighted while the court was taking place. And it completely erases the work, decades long work of feminists who have been raising these issues, including the grooming gangs, for a very long time.
Your
Mhm.
activism has faced significant backlash from both the Iranian regime and at times Western institutions. For example, Iranian state media has called you immoral, a harlot, and corrupt, and even featured you in a program labeling you anti-God. Meanwhile, in the West, you faced attempts at censorship from organizations like Warwick University Student Union and even TEDx, which labeled you your talk on creativity in challenging Islamic fundamentalism as distressing and objectionable. How do you personally cope with such attempts to silence you?
Well, I mean, I think that it's obviously not just me, but I think there are lots of people who there are attempts to silence, particularly criticism of Islam and Islamism. But again, we see it across the board on many other issues as well. So, you know, criticism, for example, of Elon Musk and Trump on X,
Mm,
or the far
mm,
right is always going on about how they defend freedom of expression. But if you criticize Brexit or their anti immigrant politics, you're an undercover jihadi and you need to be deported and you go back to where you came from. And, so it's not just something, because very often this conversation goes towards blaming the woke left really for silencing criticism, whereas
mm,
you've got those in power that actually are able to censor and silence, doing it on a very widespread scale. For example, ending very much so the right to protest, the right to freedom of association. We're seeing a lot of governments doing that, limiting what you can say if you're carrying a Palestinian flag, equating
mm.
that with defending Hamas or defending October 7th, which is definitely not the case. So, uh, or isn't necessarily the case. It could be the case, of course. So, what I want to say is that this sort of censorship is across the board, and it happens mainly by those in power. And in
Mm.
fact, when we discuss the concept of freedom of expression, it is the right to express vis-a-vis power, the powerful that are trying to silence. And so I think that's the larger context, really, of this taking place. And of course, silencing takes many forms. It's not always threats of death or violence, but it is a very sort of constant pressure
Mm.
to sort of toe the line. And I think that I find that pressure very, very suffocating at times, because um, there is always this attempt to, of course you can say what you want, but do it in a way that's more, respectful, palatable,
Mm.
um, not so offensive. Whereas really, when you talk about freedom of expression, it's my expression, it's an individual right. So I'll decide how the hell I want to do it, not you. It's not a group right. And also, what's offensive to one is just funny to somebody else, you know. And if we have limits, we begin to have limits. We actually limit the right to expression for those who are least powerful, because it is a right vis-a-vis the powerful. And so, you know, having said that, there are some real issues around this, which is, and one that I grapple with myself all the time, which is, you know, I don't want a criticism of Islam or Islamism to be used by the far right and the bigots to scapegoat Muslims and refugees and migrants, you know. So it is a difficult situation. And the only way I've found to manage it is to sort of fight on many different fronts. So to defend freedom of expression, but also to fight against racism, to work against Islam and Islamic fundamentalism, but also criticize all religions and all fundamentalisms. You know, so and always to defend, because for me, it's about defending people's freedoms and rights, and that includes the rights of believers and the rights of refugees and asylum seekers and migrants. So I think it's quite difficult. There is, of course, a section on the left that sees all criticism of Islam and Islamism as Islamophobic and
Yes.
bigotry. And that is a reality. But also, we have to remember that a large section of the left, including myself, are at the forefront of criticizing religion and the religious right. A lot of the movements against the Sharia courts, for example, for ex-Muslim rights, against stoning, against executions, against so-called honor crimes in Europe, as well as in countries of origin, in the diaspora as well, have been led by those who are on the left. So I think, again, this blanket sort of thing that it's the left that silences and the right is always pro freedom of expression is not true. They're all against freedom of expression when it suits their purposes, and they defend freedom of expression for those they agree with. And I think the point is that freedom of expression is especially for those you don't agree with,
Of
because
course.
otherwise, what's the point, really?
I feel I'm a part, I identify as leftist. But sometimes I think that they need a wake up call. So
Yeah,
I thought maybe this was her wake up call for the left
yeah.
to wake up and say, you know, you can't just step back when the violation of some human rights are held by another culture. You know,
Mhm.
it's this what I
Yeah.
mean.
I mean, I think really that this statement was a challenge to cultural relativism, that says that it depends on people's culture. In one culture, it's acceptable for women to, for example, wear the veil. In another culture, it's not. And the argument we were trying to make is that rights are not relative to the so-called culture you come from, because, as I mentioned earlier, first of all, culture is not a monolith. It's always changing, it's always being challenged. And the culture of, for example, the conservative imam, or the culture of the Ayatollah in an Islamic state, or the Islamic judge, is not the same as the culture of a woman who is wanting not to wear the veil and wants to love who she wants, or wants to be a lesbian, or wants to sing when her voice is banned, for example. You know, so I think it was a wake up call, really, to say that you cannot uh, put our rights and our freedoms, make them subservient to religion and culture. Our rights and our freedoms trump religion and culture. But I do want to say something too, that again, there's a section of the left, of course, that has this point of view, that sees, for example, Islamism as a revolutionary force, when in fact it is a counter-revolutionary force that suppresses the working class and In Iran, for example, the right to strike is considered haram, religiously prohibited. Celebrating May Day, International Workers' Day, can result in imprisonment and flogging. So there's nothing revolutionary or pro-working class of this movement. But what I want to say is that while the focus is on the so-called woke left, the right is doing this on a mass scale because it is also in power in many instances. And that is not considered um, sort of identity politics when in fact it is. So, very much if you look at the arguments of the far right in defending the white working class, for example, vis-a-vis migrants, Muslims, and refugees, is the use of identity. The working class is not white, it's not black, it's not brown. That's the whole point of the working class. The working class is a class that goes beyond borders and barriers and boundaries. It's work, the slogan is workers of the world unite. The the imposition of white on working class in order to defend whiteness vis-a-vis the hordes of migrants and Muslims and refugees who are coming into Europe is using identity politics. And in many instances, like in Italy, like in the United States, like in Hungary, you are seeing this as part of the state policy, the identity politics of Christianity, identity politics like of a Christian nation, of a white nation. So again, I want to challenge the use of these terms, cultural relativism, woke politics, identity politics, as something that's the remit of the left, whereas in fact it's very much part of state institutions and state politics, very much right-wing politics in our day and age now.
When you think about the future, what do you hope your activism will have achieved in the next 10 or maybe 20 years?
Well, I mean, I think all of us who are activists, we do hope that we will bring about lasting change. I mean, I think otherwise it's quite difficult to continue to be an activist given really the horrible state of the world. It's just it can be quite depressing. And just, people being murdered for being women in Afghanistan or Iran, people drowning at our borders, genocide taking place, crimes against humanity, and not just in countries that are on our news, because there's very limited news on what they want to cover for today. But in so many parts of the world where we don't even hear about it on the news, such huge violations are taking place. So it can be quite depressing. And to be honest, sometimes I do feel very overwhelmed and feel paralyzed. Luckily, I always seem to get out of the paralysis and this feeling of depression, and continue my work. So, but it does I think it gets anyone down. Just even walking in the street and seeing homeless people, mistreatment of animals, the whole industry, the whole meat industry, everything, the environment, it can be quite debilitating and depressing. But I think as activists, we are quite positive, we are quite hopeful, aren't we? And we kind of feel like well, in a sense, we have no choice, because I think if I didn't do something, I would not be able to get out of bed, to be honest, because I feel very, very overwhelmed by what happens. So I feel like at least it's our attempts at doing things and changing things. And I do feel in the years that I've done work that I've had an impact on people's lives. I could say in my work as the head of the International Federation of Iranian Refugees that I literally most probably did save the lives of thousands of people from deportation. Just in one instance, I spoke at the Dutch Parliament and stopped the deportation of 1,500 Iranian asylum seekers back to Iran. So that feeling of knowing or saving people from execution or stoning, like Sakina Mohammadi Ashtiani was going to be stoned in Iran. So in those sort of cases, and the fact that it's so personal, it becomes personal, doesn't it? The sort of saving people's lives with others is great. And also, I look back now at the ex-Muslim movement, for example, and I think it started. I started the organization 18 years ago, and at that time, very few people felt comfortable to say they were ex-Muslims. When we had,
Yes, you are a pioneer.
well, I mean, when we had our first conference, there was only a handful of ex-Muslims, and they were hiding on the balcony, and
Oh,
everybody else was not anything with any Muslim background. And they all said, "Are you just making a big deal about nothing? Nobody's here. No one's here. No one says this is an issue." And now, when you look at our Celebrating Dissent conferences, the large numbers of people who are ex-Muslims who don't even know who I am and who I don't know who they are. I mean, that's the great thing about it, isn't it? It's people doing lots of different things and making themselves seen and heard in ways that are really opening up the space, I think, not just for apostates and atheists, but for Muslims themselves. Because really, if you look at the rise of the so-called Muslim reformers in contemporary history, in current history, a lot of it is linked with the rise of the ex-Muslim movement. Because when you open up the space to be able to criticize and question and doubt, you open it up for everybody, including for believers. So I think that is something that I'm very, very proud of. And also, I think the whole sort of topless nude protest that I've done, I found that very, very challenging for myself personally. That was actually the hardest thing I've ever done in my life as a form of protest. And it caused and continues to cause, especially amongst Iranians, for example, and the region, huge debates and discussions and a lot of pressure to conform. But it is, I think, a really important way of taking back our bodies from those who use it as a tool of suppression and to use it instead for liberation. So I guess those are the things that I'm happy with. And I think just we need to continue. Hopefully, we will have long-lasting impacts, but only history will be able to judge us on that. We have to keep going and doing what we can, however little it is, because I guess we have a responsibility to do so.
mhm. So I consider you as the godmother of ex-Muslims. So reflecting of what you've said all above, what advice would you give to someone, especially women in this case, who's questioning their faith but feels trapped by fear or societal pressure as a last question?
I mean, I think the first thing is always to tell people to keep safe. I think no one can. A lot of people want sort of advice on what they should do, and it's impossible to give advice because everyone knows their situation better than anyone else who can give them advice. So all I could say is that it's important to always be safe. You know your situation better than most. But I think the main thing to know is that you're not alone, that there are so many of us out there. And because of social media, we have this opportunity to link up with others because we can feel strength in numbers. And we also, I think, one of the things that always I used to hear when we started out was that I felt like I was crazy. I felt like there was, something wrong with me for thinking this way, for doubting this way. I was sick, and now people say that less and less because there are so many out there. So reaching out to others, there is this feeling of you feel stronger, like when we go to the Celebrating Dissent conferences, for example, that I organize for ex-Muslims, people, one of the main things they say is that it feels great just to be with other people who think the same way, to know that there's nothing wrong with you, that there are so many of us, there's strength in this. So keeping safe, reaching out, finding strength from others, and realizing that even though we're not the same as a church community, for example, where you have to believe bullshit and pay us money, you don't have to do either. It's about sort of having a community that has your back. And of
Yes.
course, Unfortunately, we don't have the resources or the power that the churches do, so we can't have the back of people in the way that we want. But we can all try our best to do that. And one of the things we've done is we've started the Ex-Muslims International, which is a coalition of ex-Muslim organizations. It now has recently had its own website, and we're campaigning together, we're working together jointly, both organizations and activists, because again, there is strength in that. And there are so many resources amongst us that ex Muslims should get at least some support and some information and some help that they need, if not all.
So this was the final question. A big thank you. We are done, Mariam. So thank you for making this space today a place of great inspiration, an uplifting hour for me, and I hope for ex-Muslim women and men living here in Italy, and as well for anyone currently experiencing a critical or marginalized situation and feels unable to find a way out. Whether your stories are big or small, your voices deserve to be heard. The more voices we have, the stronger our demands will resonate. There's a song by Peter Gabriel called Biko that says, "You can
Mhm.
blow out a candle, but you can't blow out a fire." It perfectly sums up what your activism is all about. With that, we thank you for being here with us until now. Thank you so much.
Thank
And we'll
you.
see you again soon. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.